Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I am Billi.
I'm Zara.
Last week, a 14-year-old killed 4 people, 2 students and 2 teachers, at his school in the US state of Georgia. He also injured another 9 in what was the country's 385th mass shooting this year. In the days following the incident, the shooter's father has been arrested for multiple charges, including involuntary manslaughter, in relation to his son's killings. So, should parents be held legally liable for the actions of their child? In today's deep dive, we will explore the precedent that has been set in the US.
So, Billi, in today's deep dive, I know that you want to explore this angle that we've seen in headlines and you and I have been speaking about a bit, which is whether or not parents should be held criminally responsible for their child's criminal actions. Before we explore that angle, though, I did just want you to maybe take a step back and lay out the facts as to why we're actually talking about this story today.
Yeah, so on Wednesday last week, a 14-year-old boy was arrested over a fatal school shooting in the US state of Georgia. Now, authorities allege that the 14-year-old boy opened fire at his local high school, and it's alleged that he killed 2 teachers and 2 students before he surrendered to authorities. I think it's one of the rare examples where the shooter is actually still alive.
Yeah.
And so he is in custody and he faced court on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
9 others were also injured in the shooting. And at the time of recording, no motive has been identified. We do know that he seemed to have this real interest around mass shootings, but we don't know too much more about that. Authorities are still investigating that.
Yeah.
What we do know is that it was the state of Georgia's deadliest school shooting in its history. And we also know, according to analysis by the Washington Post, that the boy is the youngest mass school shooter in about 25 years in the US. Now, the 14-year-old was charged with 4 counts of felony murder, and authorities have announced that they have charged him as an adult, not as a minor, which is allowed in the state of Georgia. Now, why we're talking about it today is that on Thursday night, authorities held a press conference and they announced that the father of the 14-year-old boy has also been arrested and is facing his own charges in relation to his son's actions. And you could really tell during the press conference, which was, like I said, just held 2 days after the mass shooting, just how raw the devastation still was.
We're heartbroken. A young person brought a gun into a school, committed an evil act, and he took lives and he injured many other people, not only physically but mentally.
And I mean, obviously the investigation into the shooter and what motivated him and why he did what he did is ongoing. So we might just park that there for a second. But what I find so interesting is that you mentioned the father has been arrested.
Yeah, it goes around this idea that just because the father didn't pull the trigger, does that mean that he can't be held legally liable for his son's actions?
What has he been charged with? Because I imagine that that's quite a complex legal area to explore.
So he was arrested and charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 2 counts of second-degree murder, and 8 counts of cruelty to children.
Can you just step listeners through what those charges actually mean? I mean, I know that we didn't get a whole heap of information, but just in a general sense, what do those mean?
Yeah, the authorities did decline to explain the charges further, but I'll tell you quickly what those different charges usually mean. So involuntary manslaughter essentially means the illegal killing of someone without malice and without intent. And then second-degree murder means the killing was unplanned or it was impulsive. Now, the only thing that authorities did say in relation to these charges is that the father allegedly knowingly allowed his son to possess a weapon. And when I was doing research for this, I saw that sources had spoken to CNN who had said that the shooter's father actually bought the gun that was used in the mass shooting as a holiday present for his son in December of 2023. Now, that's just what sources are saying. It hasn't been confirmed by the authorities, but I think it does kind of paint a picture of kind of the environment that this boy was possibly living in.
I also saw headlines about the fact that authorities seem to have had prior contact with the father before this incident. Can you just provide a bit more information there?
Yeah, so they had contact with the father and also the boy. So last year, Colt Gray, that's the name of the 14-year-old boy, he posted online a comment that said, quote, "shoot up a middle school." And so that was posted on Discord under a pseudonym, a username that wasn't his direct name. And that caused someone who saw it to reach out to authorities to investigate if that was a real threat. Now, I should say that at the time they didn't know if it was definitely him. So authorities went to the boy's house and they spoke to him. He was then 13 years old, and they also spoke to his father. And the boy denied that it was him who posted that threat, who posted that comment. And at the time, Colt's father also told authorities that his son, quote, "knows the seriousness of weapons and what they can do and how to use them and not use them." And that's according to a transcript of the conversation that was obtained by the New York Times. Investigators ultimately decided after that conversation with Colt and his father that they couldn't conclusively prove that Colt was behind the account that posted that threat. And so they basically just left it at that.
I mean, there's so much there, and I'm sure there's so much that's going to be combed through to understand how, you know, they got from there to the incident that happened last week. But it's clear that the shooter's father was already in some sort of conversation with authorities, as you said, that didn't really go anywhere. But broadening out from just this case, is there a precedent for a parent actually being held legally liable for the actions of their child?
Yeah, so the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was actually asked that exact question during their press conference on Thursday. And they said that they weren't aware of any precedent for this, but they hadn't looked into it. Clearly, it wasn't a priority at the time. But if we look elsewhere in the country, there is precedent for this, and there's quite recent precedent for this. So earlier this year in the US state of Michigan, the parents of a teenager who murdered 4 students at a school in 2021, they were found guilty. So the parents were found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, and they were sentenced to at least 10 years in prison.
And just to clarify, involuntary manslaughter is the same charges that this father is facing.
Yeah, it's included in the slate of charges that the father is facing, but he's also facing other ones as well. Now, the names of these parents were James and Jennifer Crumbly, and their guilty verdict represented the first time parents in the US had been held criminally responsible for a mass shooting by their child.
I think that it's pretty astounding given, I think we mentioned that we were above 350 mass shootings just this year alone, just in the US, that it was only this year for the very first time that that precedent was set for a parent to be held criminally responsible for the actions of their child. What were the prosecutor's arguments in that specific case talking about their James and Jennifer Crumbly?
Yeah, so the prosecutors argued that the parents had ignored quite clear warning signs and that they also missed cries for help from their son, who was quite open about the fact that he was struggling with his mental health. There was a lot of evidence about him drawing pictures that said, "help me." So the prosecutors were saying that they just completely ignored that. One of the prosecutors said in their closing argument, referring to the dad here, quote, "James Crumbly was presented with the easiest, most glaring opportunities to prevent the deaths of these 4 students, and he did nothing."
Wow.
They also said that the father had actually bought the gun for his son as an early Christmas present for him 4 days before the mass shooting occurred in 2021.
It's almost eerie how similar some of the storylines here are.
Yeah, I mean, the current case that we're talking about is only allegations, so we can't say conclusively that there are direct parallels, but just reading about it, you can't help but just think how similar these 2 cases do seem. And the prosecutors also said that the parents failed to secure the gun, so failed to put it in any safe place that would have avoided their son using it without their supervision. Now, that was the main focus from the prosecutors on the father. that he had literally bought the gun that his son used to kill 4 people, and that he made no effort to prevent his son from carrying out this dangerous crime. But for the mother, it was a little bit different. They presented a different argument and different evidence for her. They provided evidence that they said suggested that she was negligent and detached as a mother, and that, like I said before, she ignored warning signs that prosecutors say were clearly there. And in both cases, the prosecutors were successful in arguing that the parents should be held legally liable for the actions of their child. And that case has certainly set a precedent for the country. It was a really historic decision made by the jurors. And it will be interesting to see how it does set precedent for future cases.
Yeah. I mean, this, as you have said, there seem to be quite a few similarities in the cases, and it'll be interesting to see what the criminal process looks like from here. Clearly, there is this, I don't know if movement is the right word, but there is this effort to try and broaden the understanding of how and why these mass shootings are occurring at the rate they are. And that partly the role of parents is, being looked at and examined and coming under question. Are there arguments against this logic? What is the other side of the coin when it comes to who should be held criminally responsible?
Yeah, I looked into this and I read a few different opinions from academics who explained why some could be against this criminal justice approach, or not necessarily against it, but maybe just cautious about maybe over-relying on it.
Yeah.
So one opinion I read was just posing the question, where do you draw the line in holding one person responsible for another person's actions?
I mean, I think that's interesting because that would probably fall down in this case when we're talking about a 14-year-old.
Yes.
I feel like that logic can, I guess, hold up when we're talking about an adult, but a 14-year-old, I think is different.
Yeah, but I guess what this academic was saying that, if your child shoplifts, for example, is that something like now, because we have this precedent, is that something that now you can hold the parents legally responsible for a less severe crime?
Yeah.
I guess it was the argument there. Another article I read was by academic Victoria Kane for Time magazine, and she was basically saying that there isn't actually proof that going down this route could actually reduce youth crime. So she said, quote, "The biggest problem with such laws is that they have never been proven to prevent crime. Blaming individual parents for children's crimes lets communities ignore more difficult and divisive tasks, eliminating poverty, curbing child abuse, providing mental health care, and limiting children's access to guns." She also continued, quote, "As Americans lean on parental responsibility laws to prevent crime and exact retribution, they should be careful that they aren't letting the broader community off too easy."
So interesting. It reminds me in year 12 in legal studies, we were learning about the purposes of punishment. And, one of them is retribution, which is that you pay for your crimes, that there is punishment, but another is rehabilitation and another is deterrence. So it's like which of these levers is being pulled and what is actually happening broadly across society when these sort of precedents are being made.
Yeah, it's about, do you pay for the crime or do you try to address the source of the crime? And both are super important. So that's those who question it, but there are, of course, many advocates for this path, including President Joe Biden. He said last week, you've got to hold parents accountable if they let their child have access to these guns. So there are many people who are for it. Obviously, the prosecutors in the cases that I mentioned, President Joe Biden is for it, but I did think it was worth mentioning those who were questioning it.
And I mean, just on an ending note, to have the president of one of the most powerful countries in the world say it's about parents being accountable for letting their children have access to those guns, when perhaps on the other end, people are arguing that nobody should have access to those guns, opens up a different can of worms, and one that the US will continue to debate, I think, till the end of time. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of The Daily Aus.
And before we go, we are currently running a survey for this podcast. We would love to hear any feedback you have for us on what you like about the podcast, what you think we could improve on. We are all ears. A link for that is in today's show notes. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back again tomorrow.